So let us look at the options. Among these options, look at option C. It says most private planes that use centrally located airports are not equipped with radar. If you're going back to the paragraph, the first sentence says if the airspace around centrally located airports were restricted to commercial airlines and only those private planes equipped with radar, most of the private plane traffic would be forced to use outlying airfields. Now, this sentence concludes that prohibiting private planes that are not radar equipped from centrally located airports would force most private planes away from those airports. Now, this conclusion cannot be true unless it is true that most private planes, according to option C, use these airports that are not radar equipped. Now, hence the first sentence conclusion assumes this choice. Hence, option C is the right answer. Look at option A. It says outlying airfields would be as convenient as centrally located airports for most pilots of private planes. Now, the conclusion need not assume that outlying airfields are convenient for private planes, since restrictions would give planes that are not radar equipped no choice. Look at the rest of the three options B, D and E. What does the conclusion concern? It concerns only how radar equipment would affect the volume of private plane traffic. Hence, these three options B, D and E, which deal with commercial planes and with risk of mid-air collision, need not be assumed. In recent years, many cabinet makers have been winning acclaim as artists, but since furniture must be useful, cabinet makers must exercise their craft with an eye to the practical utility of their product. For this reason, cabinet making is not art. Which of the following is an assumption that supports drawing the conclusion above from the reason given for that conclusion? Among these options, look at option D. An object is not an art object if its maker pays attention to the object's practical utility. Now, what does the argument conclude? It concludes that cabinet making is not an art because cabinet makers must consider the practical utility of their products. Now, if this is true, that an object is not a work of art if its maker pays attention to the object's practical utility. If you look at the option as this option says, the conclusion is supported. Hence, option D is the answer. Look at option A and option E. Now, what is the argument concerned? The argument is concerned with whether or not the cabinet makers must take the practical utility of their products into consideration, but not with either their monetary value as mentioned in choice E, or what actually happens to them according to option A. Hence, wrong. Look at options B and C. Again, the argument is not concerned with precise degree to which individual cabinet makers take the practical utility of cabinets into consideration. Hence, B and C are also not appropriate. Traditionally, decision making by managers, that is reasoned step by step, has been considered preferable to intuitive decision making. However, a recent study found that top managers used intuition significantly more than did most middle or lower level managers. This confirms the alternative view that intuition is actually more effective than careful methodical reasoning. The conclusion above is based on which of the following assumptions? Look at option E. It says top managers are more effective at decision making than middle or lower level managers. Now, if top managers are not the more effective design makers, then the fact that they use intuition more than lower level managers will not support the conclusion that intuition is more effective. And because the argument must assume, option E is the best answer. Look at option A. Now, to the extent that less effective methods are inappropriate, the passage will not assume option A and option, but it argues for it. Hence, option A is also not the answer. Cannot be. Option B. Now, since the argument leaves open the possibility of situation in which top managers are unable to use one of the methods, again, this option is also not appropriate. So also with options C and D. How about C? Because the ease with which a method is implemented is not an issue. And according to D, the argument is consistent with managers at all levels using intuition in the minority of the decisions that have been made. Emissions from automobiles that burn gasoline and automobiles that burn diesel fuel are threatening the quality of life on our planet, contaminating both urban air and global atmosphere. Therefore, the only effective way to reduce such emissions is to replace the conventional diesel fuel and gasoline used in automobiles with cleaner burning fuel such as methanol that creates fewer emissions. Which one of the following is an assumption on which the argument depends? So look at the last sentence. The only effective way to reduce such emissions is to replace the conventional diesel fuel and gasoline used in automobiles with cleaner burning fuel such as methanol that create fewer emissions. So these effectively, these emissions, they effectively reduce, right? And they also must replace the conventional fuels. So according to the author, in order to effectively reduce emissions, conventional fuels must be replaced. So let us look at the options. First one, reducing the use of automobiles would not be a more effective means to reduce automobile emissions than the use of methanol. Now, if you consider the author's position that the only effective way to reduce emissions is fuel replacement, then wouldn't it be more effective to simply stop using cars altogether? Now, if you use the assumption negation technique and if you ask yourself the following statement would be the very same first option but without the word not. So, right? So if you ask yourself this question by saying, reducing the use of automobiles would be a more effective means to reduce automobile emissions than the use of methanol. Now, this answer will clearly show that there are more effective ways of reducing emissions, and therefore this answer attacks the argument, and this must be the correct answer. Every year, many people become ill because of airborne mold spores in their homes. After someone becomes ill, specialists are often hired to eradicate the mold. These specialists look in damp areas of the house since mold is always found in places where there is substantial moisture. If one wishes to avoid mold poisoning, then one should make sure to keep all internal plumbing in good condition to prevent leakage that could serve as a breeding ground for mold. Which of the following is an assumption on which the argument depends? So what is the basic structure for this argument? It is the fact that mold is always found in places where there is substantial moisture, right? So that is the basic structure of the argument. So for us to therefore avoid mold and the resultant mold poisoning, people should take steps to prevent wet areas. Now, what does the argument assume? It assumes that wet areas occur first, causing mold to grow. And conversely, this assumption requires that mold growth itself does not occur first, creating wet areas as a result. Let's look at the options. The first one says mold itself does not create moisture. That's the correct one, right? This is the assumption on which the argument depends. Why? Because the reason mold and wetness are observed together is that wet areas causes mold growth. And if the reverse causation happens, that is, if mold causes wetness, if that was true, then keeping all plumbing in good condition to prevent leakage would do very little or no, it wouldn't prevent the, it would do little to prevent the growth of mold. Hence, this option eliminates the alternate causation. If you look at the rest of the options, the second one, most homeowners know enough about plumbing to determine whether theirs is in good condition. Now, if most homeowners know enough about plumbing to determine whether theirs is in good condition, then the recommendation made in this argument would be more useful. However, that is not the assumption on which the argument depends. Option C, mold cannot grow in dry areas. Now, if mold could grow in dry areas, the fact that mold is always almost found in wet areas is still valid. Now, this is the fact upon which the argument is based. So, the argument does not depend upon the unnecessarily absolute assertion that mold cannot grow in dry areas. Option D, no varieties of mold are harmless. If there were some varieties of mold, if there are varieties that are harmless, then the conclusion of this argument would be that one should make sure to keep all internal plumbing in good condition, right? In good condition to prevent leakage and minimize the mold growth, and that could be still valid. Hence, this argument does not depend upon the unnecessarily absolute assertion that no varieties of mold are harmless. Mold spores cannot be filtered from the air. Now, whether mold spores can be filtered from air may be relevant to a conclusion about health effects of mold in the home, but it is not directly relevant to this conclusion that one should make sure to keep all internal plumbing in good condition to prevent leakage and hence minimize mold growth. Smoking is a known cause of certain serious health problems, including emphysema and lung cancer. Now, an additional concern can be added to the list of maladies caused by smoking. A recent study surveyed by smokers and non-smokers, a recent study surveyed both smokers and non-smokers and found that smokers are significantly more anxious and nervous than non-smokers. Now, although the premise of this argument suggests only a correlation between anxiety and nervousness, but the argument has a casual conclusion. It says, it concludes that smoking causes individuals to be anxious and nervous. So it follows the A causes B relation. Now, any assumption in a causal argument must support the causal direction of the conclusion, right? Which is this, as opposed to some other explanation. Now, often assumptions support a causal conclusion either by eliminating an alternate cause for the conclusion. Which was the alternate cause for the conclusion? That is, C did not cause B, right? Either this or by demonstrating that the causation, if one exists, is in the proper direction, which is B did not cause A, right? So, these both. Now, let us look at the options. Look at the option B. It says anxiety and nervousness do not make individuals more likely to start smoking. Now, for smoking to be the cause of anxiety and nervousness, which is A caused B, it must be true that these individuals were not more likely to be anxious and nervous before they started smoking. If smokers had these conditions, like preconditions, which contributed to their decision to begin smoking, that will be the second. B did not that will mean that B caused A, which is our conclusion that smoking causes these maladies, and that would be incorrect. Hence, B is the assumption on which the argument rests. A researcher discovered that people who have low levels of immune system activity tend to score much more lower on tests of mental health than do people with normal or high immune system activity. The researcher concluded from this experiment that the immune system protects against mental illness as well as against physical disease. The researcher's conclusion depends on which of the following assumptions. Now, what does the researcher conclude? The researcher concludes from the association of low immune system activity with low mental health source that, in effect, immune system activity can inhibit mental illness. If you look at the options, among these options, look at the fourth one. Mental illness does not cause people's immune system activity to decrease. Now, contrary to this option, mental illness can depress immune system activity. The association mentioned does not support the researcher's conclusion. Hence, this option, this must be assumed. Look at options A and C. Normal immune system activity could protect against mental illness without high immune system activity, offering increased protection or prevention. And this is contrary to what these both options state. Hence, neither of these is assumed. The conclusion, if you look at options B and E, the conclusion does not depend on there being a similarity between mental and physical illness or a difference in treatment. Hence, B and E are also not assumed, right? Hence, D is the one that must be assumed. That mental illness does not cause people's immune system activity to decrease. Although there has been great scientific debate for decades over global warming, most scientists now agree that human activity is causing the Earth's temperature to rise. Though predictions vary, many global warming experts believe that average global temperatures will rise between 3 and 8 degrees Fahrenheit during the next century. Such an increase would cause an alarming rise in sea levels, displacing millions of people by destroying major population centers along the world's coastlines. Which of the following is an assumption in support of the argument's conclusion? Now, the argument concludes that rising sea levels caused by global warming will destroy major coastlines along the world and will also destroy population centers in these major coastal areas and displace millions of people. Any assumption in support of this conclusion would have to corroborate that these events will definitely take place. Let us look at the options. First, new technological developments in the next century will not divert rising seas from the world's coastal cities. Now, if new technological developments in the next century allow people to divert rising seas from the world's cities or the population centers, then these cities will not be destroyed and millions of peoples will not be displaced. That's why hence a necessary assumption is that these technologies will not be developed. Now, this assumption in support of the argument's conclusion is Correct. Hence, A is the option. If you look at the rest of the options, option B, individuals will not become more aware of the steps they can take to reduce the emission of greenhouse gases. A simple awareness of the steps to reduce emissions in no way undermines the argument's conclusion, as this answer choice does not describe any action taken by individuals. Also, greenhouse gases are never mentioned as the primary byproduct of human activity that causes global warming and are therefore not sufficient to address the argument. Option C. Rising sea levels similarly affect all coastal population centers. Again, the argument never suggests that all coastal population centers are similarly affected, and this choice is too extreme and overreaching for the argument's conclusion. Option D. Some global warming experts predict a greater than 8 degree Fahrenheit increase in global temperatures during the next century. Now, this might be true, but it is not an assumption on which the conclusion rests. Instead, this option will simply become an inference that might be drawn from the premises. Last option, human activity is the sole cause of increasing global temperatures. Again, the idea that human activity is the sole cause of global warming is neither suggested nor assumed by the argument. In addition, the word, sole cause, again, it is too extreme. Hence, options D and E also are not appropriate. The media claims that the economy is entering a phase of growth and prosperity. They point to lower unemployment rates and increased productivity. This analysis is phased though. The number of people filing for bankruptcy has increased every month for the last 6 months, and bankruptcy lawyers report that they are busier than they have been in years. Which of the following is an assumption on which the argument depends? Now, what is the conclusion of the argument? It is that the media are wrong in saying that the economy is entering a phase of growth and prosperity. Now, the basis for that claim is that the number of people filing for bankruptcy has increased every month for the last 6 months, and also that bankruptcy lawyers are busier than they have been in years. Now, for this argument to be valid, however, the author has to assume that the increase in the number of bankruptcies is a result of the state of the economy and not just the result of something unrelated. Now, look at option C. Legislation has not been recently passed to make legal bankruptcy easier to obtain. Now, this has to be true for the conclusion to hold. Why? Because if legislation has recently been passed, that it makes, easier to obtain bankruptcy, then the evidence cited would be less relevant. The increased number of bankruptcies could have been the result of the easier process rather than that of because of the poor economy. Look at option A. Unemployment rates are not useful indicators of growth and prosperity. This statement does not have to be true for the claim that the media are wrong about the economy to hold. Even if unemployment rates are useful indicators of growth and prosperity, the media could still be wrong about the economy. Option B. Economic growth cannot be measured in terms of productivity. Now, again, this does not have to be true for the conclusion to hold. Why? Because productivity could be a good measure of economic growth, but the media could still be wrong about the economy. Option D. There has not been an increase in the number of bankruptcy lawyers. Now, this does not have to be true again. Why? And because an increase in the number of bankruptcy lawyers would not explain the increase in the number of bankruptcy filings. Option E. The media often misrepresent the current state of economic affairs. This does not have to be true again for the claim that the media are wrong about the economy to be whole, for the economy to hold. So the media is not responsible. Even if the media did not often misrepresent the current state of economic affairs, the argument that the media is wrong might still hold. Research shows that adolescents who play video games on a regular basis are 3 times as likely to develop carpal tunnel syndrome as adolescents who do not play video games. Federal legislation that prohibits the sale of video games to minors would help curb this painful wrist condition among adolescents. The doctor's conclusion depends on which of the following assumptions. Now, the doctor concludes that federal legislation prohibiting the sale of video games to minors would reduce the incidence of carpal tunnel syndrome. Now, this conclusion hinges on the assumption that the only way for adolescents to access video games is to purchase the games themselves. Look at option D. Most parents would refuse to purchase video games for their adolescent children. Now, for the doctor's recommended legislation to reduce the incidence of carpal tunnel syndrome among adolescents, the prohibition from the purchase of video games must result in the actual possession of fewer video games. Hence, it must be assumed that the parents will not simply purchase video games for their children. Hence, it has to be option D. Look at the rest of the options. Option A. The majority of federal legislators would vote for a bill that prohibits the sale of video games to minors. Now, majority consensus in the legislature has no bearing on whether the recommended legislation would actually help to curb carpal tunnel syndrome. Hence, option A will not work out. Option B. Not all adolescents who play video games on a regular basis suffer from carpal tunnel syndrome. Now, this argument states that adolescents who play video games on regular basis are 3 times likely to develop carpal tunnel syndrome. Hence, this argument will directly indicate that carpal tunnel syndrome does not affect all adolescents who play video games. Rather, it becomes an assumption that this answer choice is simply an inference drawn from the given text. Option C. Playing video games is the only way an adolescent can develop carpal tunnel syndrome. The fact that adolescents can develop this syndrome by means other than playing video games has no bearing on whether the recommended legislation would help to curb carpal tunnel syndrome. Option E. The regular playing of video games by adolescents does not produce such beneficial effects as better hand-eye coordination and improved reaction time. The fact that video games can benefit adolescents in other ways has no bearing on whether the recommended legislation would help to curb carpal tunnel syndrome. Let's look at the fourth type, to weaken. Now, all weaken questions will have either a fact conclusion or a fact reason, that A causes B relationship. We can never negate a fact, remember that. And also we can negate only the conclusion or the reason, right? Only the conclusion or the reason, but you can never negate a fact. Weaken questions, these questions have options, and these options have to contain outside information, that is extra facts. Also remember, weaken does not mean to destroy. So even mild choices may be true. So keep that in mind. An example, as the Indian cricket team performed badly in the last World Cup, it should not be sent for the next World Cup. Fact, the Indian cricket team performed badly in the last World Cup. Conclusion, it should not be sent for the next World cup. Now how to weaken it? Now there can be many answers. One, that the team composition has changed. The second one could be that the team has been on a winning streak since then. After that game, that is. Playing conditions like considering the pitch, etc. will suit the team this time, whereas last time they were unsuitable. The coach has changed. Learning, not winning, is the objective of the team. Or that the World Cup has a history that the winner of the World Cup in a particular season essentially performed badly in the previous World Cup, etc. So, these could be many of the answers on how to further weaken it. Another example. Over the last 2 months, a police station has started receiving many more calls about crime in the adjoining areas. This is a clear indication of the fact that crime is on the rise in the adjoining areas. Fact, over the last 2 months, a police station has started receiving many more calls about crime in the adjoining areas. Conclusion, crime is on the rise in the adjoining areas. Now, how to weaken it? So this is more like an A causes B situation. That is, more calls about crime leads to more crime, and we cannot question facts but only the reason. And what will be the process? You have to ID the conclusion. Try to come up with your own answer. Again, new information choices are welcome. Always undermine the conclusion with the help of a choice and look out for alternative explanations in fact-reason relationships. How to weaken A cause B? Try to show that C or some other element causes B. Show that when A happened, B did not happen. Try to show that when B happened, A did not happen. When B causes A, that is reverse relationship. Now, how can A causes B can be further written as? You can say caused by, because of, responsible for, reason for, leads to, induced by, promoted by, so on and so forth. What are the common words used in this case? Weaken, attack, undermine, refute, argue against, call into question, cast, doubt, challenge, damage, counter, absurdity, vulnerable, flaw, counter, questionable, and fallacious. The first example. The number of airplanes equipped with the new anti-collision device has increased steadily during the past 2 years. During the same period, it has become increasingly common for key information about an airplane's altitude and speed to disappear suddenly from air traffic controllers' screens. The new anti-collision device, which operates at the same frequency as the air traffic radar, is therefore responsible for the sudden disappearance of key information. Which of the following, if true, most seriously weakens the argument? In this case, the classic error would be assuming that just because two events occur simultaneously, you can assume that one must cause the other. In this case, the anti-collision device is leading to the sudden disappearance of the key information. So let us look at the options. So among these options, look at option D. It says key information began disappearing from controllers' screens 3 months before the new anti-collision device was first installed. Now shows that although the effect exists, the cause did not occur. Now in this instance, the effect of the information disappearing from the screen occurred prior to the creation of the supposed causal agent, which is the anti-collision device. Hence, it will be choice D. Look at option A. The new anti-collision device has already prevented a considerable number of mid-air collisions. Now, this answer presents another effect of the cause, but this additional effect does not weaken the argument. To analogize this answer to the argument, try to imagine a scenario wherein a speaker concludes that playing football makes a person more prone to sustaining a leg injury. Now, would suggesting that playing football makes a person more prone to a head injury, which is another effect, undermine the first statement? No, hence it's not option A. Option B. It was not until the new anti-collision device was introduced that key information first began disappearing suddenly from controllers' screens. Now, this is an opposite answer that supports the conclusion. Right? We need something that weakens the argument. Now, by showing that the key information did not disappear prior to the appearance of the anti-collision device, the argument is strengthened because the likelihood that the device is at fault is increased. Option C. The new anti-collision device is scheduled to be moved to a different frequency within the next 2 to 3 months. Again, this information has no effect on determining if the device causes the information to disappear from the screen because it references an event that has yet to occur. Option E. The sudden disappearance of key information from controllers' screens has occurred only at relatively large airports. Now, this answer choice has no impact on the argument, and we cannot make a judgment based on the size of the airport because the argument did not mention airport size or anything directly related to the size of the airport. Hence, not even option E. The average life expectancy for the United States population as a whole is 73.9 years. But children born in Hawaii will live an average of 77 years. And those born in Louisiana, 71.7 years. If a newlywed couple from Louisiana were to begin their family in Hawaii, therefore their children would be expected to live longer than would be the case if the family remained in Louisiana. Now, which of the following, if true, would most seriously weaken the conclusion drawn in the package? Look at option C. The longevity ascribed to Hawaii's current population is attributable mostly to genetically determined factors. Now, this option suggests that a significant proportion of Hawaii's population is genetically predisposed to be long-lived. And since Louisianans are not necessarily so predisposed, and since the Louisianans' children will acquire their genetic characteristics from their parents, not from their birthplace. And this choice definitely presents a reason to doubt that Hawaiian-born children of native Louisianans will have an increased life expectancy. Hence, this will be the best choice. Look at option A. Insurance company statisticians do not believe that moving to Hawaii will significantly lengthen the average Louisianan's life. Now, because the conclusion concerns people born in Hawaii, not the average Louisianan, this option does not weaken the conclusion. Look at option B. The governor of Louisiana has falsely alleged that statistics for his state are inaccurate. Because the governor's allegations are false, it cannot affect the conclusion, right? Option D. 30% of all Louisianans can expect to live longer than 77 years. Now, this option fails to weaken the conclusion because it is consistent with the information provided and the conclusion about life expectancy also. Option E. Most of the Hawaiian Islands have levels of air pollution well below the national average for the United States. By suggesting that Hawaii's environment is in one respect particularly healthy. This option in fact supports the conclusion, and option C is the one that weakens the conclusion. A program instituted in a particular state allows parents to prepay their children's future college tuition at current rates. The program then pays the tuition annually for the child at any of the state's public colleges in which the child enrolls. Parents should participate in the program as a means of decreasing the cost of their children's college education. Which of the following, if true, is the most appropriate reason for parents not to participate in the program? Now, what does the passage recommend? It recommends that parents participate in a tuition prepayment program as a means of decreasing the cost of their children's future college tuition education, right? So look at the options. Look at option B. The amount of money accumulated by putting the prepayment funds in an interest-bearing account today will be greater than the total cost of tuition for any of the public colleges when the child enrolls. Now, this is true. Why? Because placing the funds in an interest-bearing account would be more cost-effective than participating in the prepayment program. Hence, this would be a reason for not participating, and hence is the best answer. Look at options C and D. The annual cost of tuition at the state's public colleges is expected to increase at a faster rate than the annual increase in the cost of living. Some of the state's public colleges are contemplating large increases in tuition next year. Now, these both options state that tuition will increase and provide support for participating in the program. Hence, no. Look at option E. The prepayment plan would not cover the cost of room and board at any one of the state's public colleges. Now, this is not clearly relevant to deciding whether to participate since the expenses mentioned fall outside the scope of the program. The ice on the front windshield of the car had formed when moisture condensed during the night. The ice melted quickly after the car was warmed up the next morning because the defrosting vent, which blows on the front windshield, was turned on full force. Which of the following, if true, most seriously jeopardizes the validity of the explanation for the speed with which the ice melted? Now, the speed with which the ice on the windshield melted is attributed to the air blowing full force from the defrosting vent onto the front windshield. So let us look at the options. Look at the second option, option B. Even though no attempt was made to defrost the back window, the ice there melted at the same rate as did the ice on the front windshield. Now, this explanation is undermined because no attempt was made to defrost the back window and the ice on the back window melted as quickly as did the ice on the windshield. Hence, this seriously jeopardizes the validity of the explanation for the speed with which the ice melted. Hence, B is the best answer. Look at option A. The side windows had no ice condensation on them. Now, in the absence of other information, the lack of ice condensation on the side windows that is mentioned here is irrelevant to the validity of the explanation. Option C. The speed at which ice on a window melts increases as the temperature of the air blown on the window increases. Now, this might support the explanation since the air from the defrosting vent was warm. Look at options D and E. The warm air from the defrosting vent for the front windshield cools rapidly as it dissipates throughout the rest of the car. The defrosting vent operates efficiently even when the heater which blows warm air towards the feet or faces of the driver and passengers is on. Now, neither of these both options give a reason to doubt that air from the vent caused the ice's melting, and hence neither of them jeopardizes the explanation's validity. A conservation group in the United States is trying to change the long-standing image of bats as frightening creatures. The group contends that bats are feared and persecuted solely because they are shy animals that are active only at night. Which of the following, if true, would cast the most serious doubt on the accuracy of the group's contention? Now, this group's contention suggests that animals that are shy and active at the night are feared and are persecuted for that reason. Look at option D. Raccoons and owls are shy and active only at night, yet they are not generally feared and persecuted. Now, this option establishes that raccoons and owls are shy and active at night, right? And that they are neither feared nor persecuted. It's the same with the group's contention as well. That's what it suggests. Hence, option D is the best answer. Look at option A. Bats are steadily losing natural roosting places such as caves and hollow trees and are thus turning to more developed areas for roosting. Now, this does not address the original cause of that fear, right? Hence, does not make sense. Look at option B and option E. Bats are the chief consumers of nocturnal insects and thus can help make their hunting territory more pleasant for humans. People know more about the behavior of other greatly feared animal species such as lions, alligators, and greatly feared animal species. I'm sorry, this is repeated. Alligators and snakes than they do about the behavior of bats. Now, these both options, while relevant to the rationality of people's fear of bats, they do not affect, that is, these options do not affect the assessment of the accuracy of the group's contention. The last option C, bats are regarded as frightening creatures not only in the United States but also in Europe, Africa, and South America. Now, this again does not conflict with the group's explanation for the fear of bats in the United States, right? Hence, it has to be option D. Beverage company representative. The plastic ring that holds 6 packs of beverage cans together poses a threat to wild animals, which often become entangled in the discarded rings and suffocate as a result. Following our lead, all beverage companies will soon use only those rings consisting of a new plastic that disintegrates after only 3 days of exposure to sunlight. Once we all complete the switchover from the old to the new plastic rings, therefore, the threat of suffocation that plastic rings pose to wild animals will be eliminated. Which of the following, if true, most seriously weakens the representative's argument? Now, the conclusion of this argument is here in the final sentence, right, which contains the concluding factor. It says, therefore, right. And the conclusion also contains a qualification that the threat of suffocation will be eliminated after the switchover is complete. Now, the premises supporting this conclusion are that the new plastic rings will be used by all companies and that the rings disintegrate after 3 days of exposure to sunlight. But for us to personalize this argument, we have to ask ourselves, are there any holes in this argument? Because there are many. The most obvious loophole or hole here is that what if an animal becomes entangled in the new rings even before they disintegrate, right? During these 3 days. So let us look at the options. Look at option B. After the beverage companies have switched over to the new plastic rings, a substantial number of old plastic rings will persist in most aquatic and woodland environments. Right? Now this choice undermines the representative's conclusion by showing that even after the switchover is complete, the threat to animals from plastic rings will still persist. Right? And it has to be noted carefully, right, about the nature of the conclusion, that the representative does not say that the threat from the new plastic rings will be eliminated, but rather that the threat from the plastic rings, which includes both old and new. Hence, it has to be this option that weakens the representative's argument. Look at option A. The switch over to new plastic rings will take at least 2 more years to complete. Now, this option does not hurt the argument because the author qualified the conclusion to account for the date of the switchover, thereby inoculating against the avenue of attack. Again, from a personalizing standpoint, imagine what would happen if you raised this issue to the beverage company representative. That person would simply say, yes, that may be the case, but I noted in my conclusion that the program would be effective once the switchover is complete. Now that sounds like a very attractive answer because it raises a point that would be difficult, that would be a very difficult public relations issue to address. Hence, regardless of that, this does not hurt the argument given by the beverage company representative, and that is the task at hand. Option C, the new plastic rings are slightly less expensive than the old rings. This is an out of scope option, right? Because it addresses an issue that is irrelevant to the representative's argument. Choice E. The new plastic rings disintegrate into substances that are harmful to aquatic animals when ingested in substantial quantities by them. Now, this conclusion is about wild animals, and whereas this choice mentions aquatic animals, and the conclusion is specifically about suffocation. Hence, this does not address the suffocation. Opponents of law that require automobile drivers and passengers to wear seatbelts argue that in a free society, people have the right to take risks as long as the people do not harm others as a result of taking that or the risks. As a result, they conclude that it should be each person's decision whether or not to wear a seat belt. Which of the following, if true, most seriously weakens the conclusion drawn above? Now, the principle that people are entitled to risk injury provided they do not thereby harm others fails to justify the individual's right to decide not to wear seatbelts if it can be shown. If you look at the options, option B, automobile insurance rates for all automobile owners are higher because of the need to pay for the increased injuries or deaths of people not wearing seat belts. Now, this option shows that the decision does harm others. Hence, option B is the right answer. Option A. Many new cars are built with seat belts that automatically fasten when someone sits in the front seat. Now, this option suggests that the law may be irrelevant in some cases, but it does not address the issue of the law's legitimacy. Option C. Passengers in airplanes are required to wear seatbelts during takeoffs and landings. Now, this option cites a requirement analogous to the one at issue, but its existence alone does not bear on the legitimacy of the one at hand, right? The issue. Look at options D and E. The rate of automobile fatalities in states that do not have mandatory seat belt laws is greater than the rate of fatalities in states that do have such laws. In automobile accidents, a greater number of passengers who do not wear seatbelts are injured than are passengers who do wear seatbelts. Now, if you look at both these options, the argument implicitly concedes that individuals take risks by not wearing seatbelts. Hence, if you look at these both options, both D and E, they simplify. It simply confirms this concession and it does not weaken the conclusion. Hence, it will be option B. During the Second World War, about 375,000 civilians died in the United States and about 408,000 members of the US Armed Forces died overseas. On the basis of those figures, it can be concluded that it was not much more dangerous to be overseas in the armed forces during the Second World War than it was to stay in the home as civilian. Which of the following would reveal most clearly the absurdity of the conclusion drawn above? Now, concluding from the similar numbers of death in these two groups, the relative danger of death was similar for both groups is absurd, especially if one group was far smaller. So let us look at the options. Look at option D. Comparing death rates per 1,000 members of each group rather than comparing total number of deaths. Now, this option exposes that absurdity by pointing out the need to compare death rates of the two groups, which would reveal the higher death rate for the smaller group, therefore providing that D would become the best answer. Look at option B, expressing the difference between numbers of deaths among civilians and members of the armed forces as a percentage of the total number of deaths. Since the conclusion acknowledges the difference between the number of civilians and armed forces deaths, expressing this difference as a percentage is beside the point. Hence, it will not make sense. Look at option A. Counting deaths among members of the armed forces who served in the US in addition to deaths among members of the armed forces serving overseas. Now, this is inappropriate because it simply adds a third group to the two being compared. Options C and E, separating deaths caused by accidents during service in the armed forces from deaths caused by combat injuries, comparing deaths caused by accidents in the US to deaths caused by combat in the armed forces. These are both irrelevant because cause of death is not the issue. Recently in City X, developers have stopped buying land. Contractors have found themselves going without work for longer periods, and banks have issued fewer mortgages. There must be fewer new residents moving to City X than there were previously. Which of the following indicates a flaw in the reasoning above? What is the conclusion here? That there must be fewer new residents moving to City X than there were previously. Why is that so? Because of several observed factors. 1. Developers not buying land. 2. Contractors without work. And 3. Banks issuing fewer mortgages. That's what the author assumes, and it results from the fewer people trying to buy new homes. And what are we asked to find? We are asked to find a flaw in the reasoning of this argument. Look at option A. This year, several housing blocks have gone on the market after being held up for months by legal red tape. Now, this option suggests that there might be another reason for the decline in home construction. The supply of available housing has been increased through the release of many previously built homes. Hence, the reason in the argument is flawed, which will make this the answer. How about option 2? The size of homes by itself does not point to any flaw in the argument. Look at option C. What is being talked about here? The argument centers on new homes. So resales of condominiums are not directly related. How about option D? If materials cost less, it seems more likely that any decrease in new home construction could be attributed to the stated cause. And about E, sales of cars and boats are not related to the constructions of new homes. Companies that offer employer-sponsored insurance pay a portion of employees' healthcare costs. In the manufacturing sector last year, companies that offered ESI had worker absentee rates 22% lower on average than those at companies that did not offer ESI. If on the basis of the evidence above it is argued that ESI decreases worker absenteeism, which of the following, if true, would most seriously weaken that argument? Now, last year, firms in the manufacturing sector that offered employees ESI plans found that their worker absentee rates were significantly lower than at firms that did not offer ESI. Now, what could have caused the decrease? The argument is made that the existence of the ESI plan caused the decrease in worker absenteeism. But that conclusion would be weakened if another cause was identified. So let us look at the options. Look at option D. Many firms in the manufacturing sector have improved workplace safety and decreased the occurrence of on-the-job injuries in the last 5 years. And most of these companies introduced ESI at the same time. If there are fewer on-the-job injuries, then workers will miss fewer days of work. And this is an alternate explanation for the decrease in absenteeism, and hence weakens the argument that the decrease in absenteeism must have been due to the availability of ESI. Hence, option D. How about option A? Now, similar findings in other sectors of the economy strengthen rather than weaken the argument. Option B. Now, if workers have access to preventative health care as a result of the ESI plan, they might be healthier and would miss fewer days of work due to illness. Hence, this option supports the argument. Option C talks about the difficulty of initiating an ESI plan and that it is irrelevant to a conclusion about what happens after the plan is established. And the last option talks about the higher productivity of workers covered by ESI plans is consistent with the fact that they miss fewer days of work. And this statement does not weaken the argument.
You can learn any subject, anywhere, any place, and on the go. Come, let us go the other way in learning. Download our revolutionary app for free AMC.